They called her a lost cause, a frozen corpse waiting to vanish beneath the drifts. But when a lone human stepped into that blizzard and built a fire just for her, she realized warmth wasn't just for the body, it could melt even the deepest scars of the soul. The snow came down in sheets that swallowed all sound. For hours, or was it days? She lay there, her body shivering so violently that she could hardly remember her own name. Her pale gray skin, so beautiful in the warmth of her homeworld, had turned an ugly, splotchy blue. Frost clung to her eyelashes. Her fingers had long since stopped responding to her desperate orders to move. She had tried to crawl, to scream for help, to do anything, but her energy drained faster than the warmth from her veins. They had told her she was useless. After the collapse of her colony's dome, she was the last of her family left standing. When she stumbled into the outpost, gaunt and frostbitten, the other aliens there sneered. She was too weak to work, too weak to fight, too weak to barter her body for scraps of dried root or bitter gray broth. One by one, they turned their backs on her, until finally they dragged her out to the edge of the frozen plain and left her to die in silence. She remembered the echo of the door closing behind her, a heavy clang that sounded like a death knell. She had fallen to her knees then and crawled as far as she could. Her thin tunic, already torn, offered no protection against the slicing wind. She tried to whisper prayers to the old sky gods, but her teeth chattered too hard. Each breath felt like a blade raking the inside of her lungs. Finally, her mind slipped into a fog. She watched the snowfall pile up around her thighs, her waist, her shoulders. Each flake felt like a gentle caress, a soft betrayal. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered if her mother would scold her for giving up, for not fighting harder. But even that thought faded as her eyelids grew heavy. She was sure she would not open them again. Then, a sound. A low crunch, muffled by the storm. She thought it was just her last dream, her mind conjuring up footsteps so she wouldn't feel so alone at the end. But the crunching drew closer, slow and steady, deliberate in a way no animal or phantom ever moved. A figure emerged from the swirling white, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs that gleamed with melting snow. She didn't know the species at first, but when he drew near, she saw the shape of his face. A human. She had only heard rumors of them, wild stories whispered by the other survivors. Humans were terrifying, some said, with eyes that burned like stars and a cruelty that surpassed all others. Others claimed they were naive, too trusting, too soft-hearted to survive in the frozen colonies. But she had never seen one up close. His gaze swept over her quickly, assessing her condition with a strange urgency. Then, without a word, he shrugged off his massive fur cloak and draped it over her body. The instant warmth sent a painful jolt through her frozen nerves. She gasped, her eyes flying open. Her throat stung as if she'd swallowed shards of glass. "Easy," he murmured, his voice deeper than she expected. "Don't try to talk." She watched him unpack a small cylinder from his pack, then strike it against a stone. A tiny flame leapt forth, bright as a star in the endless white. Her wide eyes fixed on it, that single impossible flicker of orange that seemed to defy the universe itself. He leaned close, shielding the flame with his hands, and built it up slowly with small sticks. Sparks snapped and popped, and she felt heat spreading toward her face. She wanted to move closer to it, but her body was heavy as stone. Instead, she stared at him, her lips trembling with a half-formed question. Why? Why would he stop? Why would he care? Why would he waste precious fuel and time on something as worthless as her? He didn't answer her unspoken question. Instead, he unpacked a thin blanket and gently lifted her by the shoulders. The pain was so intense she nearly blacked out again, but when she returned, she found herself propped closer to the fire, his heavy cloak wrapped tightly around her. "Hold on," he said again, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I'll stay until you're warm enough to walk." But she knew she could not walk. Her feet had gone numb long ago, and the frostbite would claim her toes, maybe more. She knew it with the fatal certainty of someone who has already started slipping toward death's edge. Tears stung her frozen cheeks, cracking the skin. The human reached out and, surprisingly gentle, brushed them away with his thick fingers. His gloves were clumsy, but his touch held a kindness she hadn't felt in cycles. "You're not dying today," he said. His voice was like a low drum, echoing in her skull, grounding her to the moment. She couldn't look away from his eyes, bright, determined, impossibly alive. Slowly, painfully, she forced her cracked lips to move. "Why help me?" He paused, as if surprised she could still speak. Then he looked away for a moment, toward the horizon where the snow met the sky in a seamless gray blur. "I couldn't stand by," he said at last. "Not when someone was left out here to die alone." She didn't understand. She had grown up learning that survival meant turning away from the weak, hoarding every crumb and every breath. Her people had taught her that compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Yet here he was, a stranger from a different star, kneeling in the snow, risking his own life to keep a dying alien warm. She shivered again, not from cold this time, but from something deeper, an ache she couldn't name. He reached for a flask at his belt and pressed it to her lips. Warm liquid, strong, sharp, unlike anything she'd ever tasted, slipped down her throat. It burned, but it also lit a fire inside her belly, spreading tiny waves of heat into her core. She coughed, but he didn't pull it away. Instead, he murmured something soft, words she didn't understand but felt like an embrace. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed as he fed the fire, carefully adding fuel, guarding it against the relentless wind. Each time she drifted toward unconsciousness, he would gently tap her cheek, urging her to stay awake. "Stay with me," he repeated again and again, as if the words themselves could hold her soul tethered. For the first time since her family died, she didn't want to slip away. When she opened her eyes again, she saw that he had built a small shield of snow bricks around them, cutting the worst of the wind. His own cheeks were red and raw, his eyelashes crusted with frost. But he didn't complain, didn't pause to rest. She gathered what strength she had left and tried to reach for him. Her hand barely twitched in the snow. He noticed and caught it quickly, his big hand swallowing hers entirely. That single point of contact felt more real than anything she had ever known. A strangled sob escaped her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, the betrayal, the loss, the hunger gnawing at her spirit worse than any frostbite. But all she could manage was a single broken whisper. "Please don't leave me." His fingers tightened around hers. "I won't," he promised, his voice low and certain. "I'm staying right here. We'll get through this together." And in that moment, something inside her cracked. Not her bones, not her mind, something deeper, something that had been frozen long before the storm ever came. She had survived so much pain she thought her heart had turned to ice. But this human, with his strange fire and stubborn warmth, had melted it in mere hours. She realized then that she wanted to live, not just to exist, but to truly live. To feel the warmth of a fire, the strength of another's hand, the sound of her own laughter echoing across an open sky. She didn't know what awaited them beyond this snowfield, or whether they would survive another night. But she knew one thing, she would not face it alone. In the soft glow of the tiny flame, she watched the human's face. His eyes, so fierce and gentle all at once, shone like stars she had never dared to wish upon. A wild thought rushed through her mind, that maybe there was a place for her, somewhere beyond the ice and cruelty, a place where she could learn to smile again. She had nothing left to give, no treasures, no strength, no promises of usefulness. Only her broken, shivering self. Yet he had chosen to stay. For the first time, she didn't feel like a burden. She felt like a being worth saving. Her breath rattled out in uneven gasps as her body began the slow, painful fight to reclaim warmth. The human shifted closer, leaning his forehead gently against hers, as if to share not just his heat but his very spirit. "Rest," he whispered. "I'll watch over you." A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye and froze on her cheek. But beneath that tear, a small spark flickered to life, the fragile, defiant ember of hope. And there, in the white abyss where she had been sentenced to die, a tiny fire crackled defiantly. The human fed it patiently, refusing to let the wind snatch it away. She closed her eyes one more time, not in surrender but in trust, her fingers curling weakly around his. This time, when the darkness came, it felt less like an ending, and more like the beginning of something entirely new. She woke to the sound of crackling embers and the scent of smoke clinging to fur. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, that she had drifted into some comforting illusion of warmth before death claimed her. But then she felt the rough fabric of the cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders and the heavy weight of a human arm holding her close. She stirred weakly, her eyes flickering open. Snow still drifted around them in gentle spirals, but the worst of the storm had passed. A pale dawn was rising, casting long violet shadows across the icy plain. The human stirred as well, blinking sleep from his red-rimmed eyes. When he saw her moving, his face lit up in a way that took her breath away. "You're still here," he said softly, as if he dared not believe it until now. She opened her mouth to speak but could only manage a hoarse croak. He quickly reached for the flask again, warming it against his chest before pressing it to her lips. This time she drank more eagerly, feeling the warmth spread through her ribs and down into her belly. He watched every swallow like a sacred ritual. When she finished, he tucked the flask away and pressed a hand to her forehead. "Your skin's warming," he said, relief softening his usually steady voice. "That's good. Very good." She stared at him, the question from the night before still echoing in her mind. Why? But now, seeing the raw honesty in his eyes, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe she didn't need an explanation. Maybe this was who he was. Someone who would stop, who would risk everything, simply because it was the right thing to do. "I thought I'd die," she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled faintly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "I did too," he admitted. "But we're stubborn creatures, you and I." She wanted to laugh, but it came out as a strangled sound between a sob and a wheeze. Without thinking, she pressed her forehead against his chest. The rough fabric of his tunic scratched her skin, but she didn't care. He wrapped both arms around her carefully, as if afraid she might shatter in his hands. They stayed like that for a long time, two breathing beings in a vast, indifferent wasteland. Eventually he leaned back, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "We have to move soon," he said. "If we stay here too long, the cold will find us again." She nodded weakly. I can't walk," she whispered. Her voice cracked under the weight of that confession. His fingers brushed her cheek, gentle and warm. "Then I'll carry you." A fresh wave of tears burned her eyes. He made it sound so simple, as though her life was worth the extra burden, worth every slow and painful step. Before she could argue, he began packing their meager supplies. His movements were quick, efficient, each motion practiced but filled with surprising care. He checked the fire one last time, scattering the embers so nothing would catch when they left. Then he knelt before her and carefully lifted her into his arms. Her head fell against his shoulder. She felt the powerful flex of his muscles beneath her, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat echoing against her cheek. As he stood, she instinctively clutched the edge of his cloak. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and calm. "I've got you." He began trudging forward, each step breaking through the crusted snow. The icy wind nipped at their faces, but she felt the warmth radiating from his body, wrapping around her like a living blanket. She didn't know how long they walked. Time blurred into an endless series of shifting white dunes and the slow, rhythmic bounce of his gait. Once or twice, she slipped into a half-dreaming state, the cold pulling at her consciousness like an insistent hand. But each time, his voice called her back, a firm, quiet anchor in the storm. At one point, she awoke to find him sitting on a small rise, catching his breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly, sweat freezing in his hair. I can try to walk," she offered weakly. He shook his head. "Save your strength," he said. "We're close." Close to what? She had no idea. But his unwavering tone made her believe. He adjusted his grip and pressed onward, his boots crunching through the deep snowdrifts. Each step was a struggle, but he never faltered. Eventually, shapes began to emerge in the distance, small dark outlines against the endless white. As they drew nearer, she realized they were structures, rough shelters built from scavenged metal and thick plastic sheets. A settlement. Her breath caught in her throat. When they reached the outskirts, a small group of figures rushed forward, their shouts muffled by scarves and hoods. She flinched instinctively, burying her face in his neck, but he squeezed her reassuringly. "It's all right," he murmured. "They're friends." The figures surrounded them quickly, helping him lower her onto a makeshift sled. One of them, a tall alien with shimmering scales, checked her pulse and temperature with a small handheld device. "She's hypothermic but stable," the medic announced. "Get her inside quick." She felt herself being guided into a warm, dimly lit structure. Rough blankets were piled onto her, and a radiant heat lamp glowed softly in the corner. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt warmth on her skin that wasn't borrowed from another living being. The human knelt beside her, pulling off his gloves and rubbing her hands between his own. His touch was so gentle, so careful, as though she were the most fragile thing in the universe. "You're safe now," he said, looking directly into her eyes. Her lips trembled. Why did you save me?" she asked again, her voice stronger but still raw. He paused, his brow furrowing. "I guess, because no one should have to die alone in the cold," he said finally. "And I couldn't watch it happen. Not to you." Something about the way he said it, the hesitation, the way his voice softened at the end, made her heart pound painfully in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but he shook his head. "Rest now," he said. "We can talk later." But she didn't want to sleep. She wanted to hold on to the moment, to keep watching him, to remind herself this wasn't another cruel hallucination. He stayed beside her, his hand always resting on hers, anchoring her to the world. Even as her eyelids grew heavy, she fought to stay awake, but eventually exhaustion claimed her. She dreamt of warmth, of fires that never died, of laughter echoing in corridors she had never walked. She saw him in those dreams, smiling, calling her name she didn't know she had, inviting her into a world where she belonged. When she awoke, she was alone for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Then she heard footsteps, and he appeared, carrying a steaming bowl. Easy, he said, kneeling. Try to eat something. She sipped carefully, the warmth spreading to every frozen corner of her body. You've been asleep for 2 full cycles, he said softly. Your body needed it. She looked at him, her eyes filling again. Will you stay? She asked. He set the bowl aside and took her hands again. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. I meant it, we'll get through this together. She didn't know how to express the flood of emotions surging inside her. Relief, disbelief, fragile joy. She reached up hesitantly and touched his cheek. His stubble was rough under her fingertips, his skin warm despite the chill that still clung to the air. His eyes fluttered closed at her touch. I don't understand, she whispered. I have nothing to offer you. He opened his eyes and met her gaze, his expression fierce and tender all at once. You're alive, he said simply. That's enough. In that moment, the wall she had built inside her, the armor of despair, the layers of shame and self-loathing, began to crumble. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. He didn't pull away. I want to live, she said, her voice trembling. I want to try. With you. A small, radiant smile spread across his face. Then that's exactly what we'll do, he whispered. From that day on, she began to heal. Her toes were carefully treated, and though she lost a few, she learned to stand again. The settlement residents helped her, encouraged her, taught her to use her hands in new ways. But it was the human who stayed closest, guiding her steps, catching her when she stumbled, cheering each small victory. They spent long evenings near the hearth, telling stories, sharing bits of their pasts. She learned his name, a human sound that felt clumsy on her tongue at first, but grew dearer each time she said it. As the days turned to weeks, her hair began to grow back, her skin regained color. Her eyes, once hollow, began to sparkle with shy light whenever he walked into the room. She wove a small charm from scraps of cloth and beads she found in the settlement, presenting it to him one evening. He took it as though she'd handed him a crown of stars. What does it mean? He asked softly. She looked down, her cheeks heating. It means, thank you for giving me my life back. It means, you're my home now. He pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. Then I'll wear it always, he said. In the years that followed, they worked side by side to build a new shelter, stronger and warmer than anything she had known. Each stone they lifted together felt like another brick laid in the foundation of her reborn spirit. There were nights when the wind howled and the snow threatened to bury the world again. On those nights, she would wake in terror, gasping for breath, her mind flashing back to the endless white. But every time he was there, arms wrapping around her, whispering her name, reminding her she was safe. That she would never be alone again. In time, she stopped counting the days since she had been left in the snow. Instead, she began counting the days she had lived, truly lived, since he found her. And every morning, when she opened her eyes to find him already watching her with that quiet, unwavering devotion, she whispered the same words in her heart, words she had once believed she would never speak again. Thank you. Thank you for the fire. Thank you for the warmth. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for teaching me that even in the deepest cold, there is always a spark waiting to be lit, if only someone is brave enough to build a fire just for you.